Welcome everyone to another episode of Fundraising Today. Today I am joined by my colleague, Kristin Priest. Kristin, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much. Good to be here.
If this is someone's first time listening or watching, I'd love to get a little bit of your background and your expertise in philanthropy and fundraising before we get into today's topic about the Fundraising Effectiveness Project's latest data.
I've been in fundraising a little over 20 years now. I'm one of those folks that kind of stumbled into it right out of college, fell in love with it, and it's became my life's passion and work. I've worked in mid and major gifts as well as some work in the annual fund. Worked as the fundraising practitioner up until about 10, 12 years ago when I joined our team and got to work on the other side of that table, coming alongside organizations and get to sit on the insights team. So, looking at things like reports and trends, understanding how the industry is changing and evolving, how donor preferences are shaping, and how, as organizations, we can come alongside donors and meet them where they're at.
So glad to have you today. Our topic is discussing a recent report that came out from the Fundraising Effectiveness Project. I learned right before we hit record today that you were part of the founding of FEP. So, yeah, tell us a little bit more about that.
It's a part of right place, right time. I was completing my master's in philanthropic studies at Indiana University as this idea was germinating among some researchers and thought leaders in the fundraising profession around what are those key metrics? Are there easy ways that we can get quick snapshots that will let us understand some of the movement that's happening within fundraising and perhaps get a look at, I always say, the data that is actionable versus just interesting. And I love some really interesting data. But when it comes down to it, how do we identify and quickly track and monitor some of those effective measurements? And so through my research, I got to be a part of the Fundraising Effectiveness Project and then the Growth in Giving initiative for about the first 5 years as we kind of took this crazy idea and tapped into a lot of really smart people. And now, 15 years later, we've got a marker that's one of the leading ones every quarter on the industry. So I'm so proud and excited of what we did, now where it's going.
Let's dive right into this latest report. Could you provide a brief overview of the key findings from this latest FEP report, which compared the overall philanthropic giving trends of 2022 to the most recent complete year, 2023?
FEP tracks three key metrics: donors, dollars, and retention. And then within each one of those looks at some additional analysis, things like by giving level, frequency, where they're at in their life cycle, as well as by organization type. So looking at those macro trends, the donors, dollars, and retention, we do see a continuation, unfortunately, of some of the decrease that we saw in 2022. Donors are down 3.4%, retention down 2.5, and dollars is down 2.8. So we're seeing that continued decrease. But a piece that's important to remember is that we're beginning to see some of that stabilization. In 22, for example, donors were down 10%, whereas now they're only down about 3.4. So it's still a concerning trend, this slow and steady decline that we need to find a way to turn, but it is a significant stabilization versus 22, where we saw lots of unevenness.
Yes, we don't have the overall chart of total amount given every year in front of us to look at, but something that we've been hearing for the last few years is when we're seeing these declines, that it's important to look back at the pre-2020, pre-COVID giving levels to see if these declines are truly declines or if they are back to giving as usual. Now that we're entering 2024 and it's been 3 years since that kind of peak of giving in 2021, I'm starting to wonder, is this a continued stabilization, or are we actually seeing real decreases here?
I think correction is a really important and accurate term to use. For many organizations, total donors, total dollars, they're still well ahead of 2019. pre-COVID, pre-pandemic boom. And I think 2024 for many is going to be that pivotal year where it is simply, are we stabilizing at this new elevated plateau or baseline, or is it now a continued hump where we can see some continued decrease? So 2024, I think for a lot of organizations is going to be that telling marker around, is it the continued slow and steady decline, or is this simply now we're living in this new?
I definitely am going to be interested to see some of the Q1 reports that have come out around giving, and also as we're recording this at the end of April. Hard to believe, but tracking very quickly towards the mid-year, which is a little bit terrifying. So we'll have to see what some of those trend reports are looking like in June as well. Let's look at new donors. The report found that despite overall declines, new donor counts actually increased in 2023. So, what do you think drove this uptick, and how can organizations leverage this trend to keep these new donors around and continue to drive new donor growth in 2024?
The the 2.3% uptick in new donors was really one of the bright spots in the FEP report as I looked at it. If we look really closely at when that surge in new donors occurred, October, November, so when we saw that big uptick, which likely indicates a significant portion were motivated by external factors versus what we as organizations or fundraisers did. Those factors being global conflicts, the war in the Middle East, international disasters. When those happen on a really large scale, that's when we see these big bulges occurring in new donor trends. But I think in addition to that, in 2023, organizations were being much more mindful about reaching out to a more diverse potentials. Everything from our creative, so the copy and imagery we used in our acquisition pieces, to communication channels, where we tried to reach these new donors. I think that was critical in over the course of the year, drawing more new donors to the organization and moving forward into, I think, making sure that they feel seen and engaged in meaningful ways will be critical in maintaining and keeping them moving forward so that they don't fall into that lost universe.
Let's also look at one of the cool things about the FEP report is they also break down giving at different, what they call donor size or giving level. So they classify donors as micro donors is one, and then small donors, mid size, major, and then super size. Looking at those donors at that far end of the right side of the spectrum, the super size donor, these people are giving hundreds of thousands of dollars to charity. And this group is where the FEP report observed a notable decrease in the number of supersized donors in 2023. What do you think is contributing to this decline? And what are some tactics that organizations can use to retain these high level donors?
Yeah, this surprised me a bit, if I'm being real honest. Late 22 was a tough time economically. We saw lots of unevenness for the first time in the stock market. And this was reflected in some of the pulling back of those large donors. So, given the economy was relatively strong in 23, I had hoped to see some growth in what they call their supersized donors, those giving $50,000 or more. And that didn't happen. I do think we can gather a bit of insight that when we look at the reporting organizations, about 30% of the dollars reported in the FEP report come from human service organizations. So sometimes the type of sectors reported and thinking about the mass influx of smaller donations that may have come through human services. Health and education, we know higher education saw significant decrease in larger donations. And so some of that, I think, is driving this data. So if you're an organization working in animal rescue, that wasn't our experience at all. We had major donors really show up. You may fall more in line with some of your sector specific trends. But looking at the industry overall, and I think some of those takeaways for me, again, as I look forward at 20, as I mentioned, thinking beyond your typical donor also expands to beyond your typical best major donor. I think sometimes we create those self fulfilling prophecies when we say too much who do our current major donors look like? Let's go find lots more folks that look just like them, rather than saying, who are those folks that have affinity, that have giving indicators, that say, if we reach out to them in ways that feel authentic and meaningful to them, we may draw a more diverse major donor pool. So I think that's one. And the second is, again, thinking beyond our typical major gifts fundraising. Donor advised funds has been an important piece of major giving fundraising for a long while. I think we're going to see that expand. We need to see that expand in 24, especially when we're not as confident about the economy, what's going to be happening. Donor advised funds can be a really great space for donors to still fulfill their pledge commitments, some of that other giving that they want to act on but don't feel as confident about. And additionally, I'll mention this highlights the need for us to focus on pipeline, and in particular on our mid-level donors. It's understandable that we can get really focused on this year's problem, finding this year's major donors. But if we don't have those long-term growth strategies in place, it becomes almost impossible to stop that short-term fundraising mentality with the urgency of needing those big dollars right now. And so while it can be a tension point to know, man, fiscal year closes in 3 months and we're short, so we've got to find 4 donors that can give these big dollars. We also have to commit that timing to what I call the backbone of a good fundraising program. I have a special soft spot in my heart for mid-level donors. I've worked for a long time as a mid-level gift officer, but looking to that audience as well for a pipeline. They make some of our best long-term major gift prospects, as well as our planned gift prospects.
Moving on to some additional financial implications. Dollars donated decreased across donors of all sizes in 2023. What do you believe are some of the underlying reasons for this decrease?
As you mentioned, it's important to remember, even in 22, we were on the tail end of that philanthropic boom period. During a solid economy like we had through most of 22, it's easier to retain those new donors that might have come to us in 20 or 21, even that might have joined due to a national or international event. But as we struggled with rising inflation and a less certain economic outlook, I think we saw the tail end of our pandemic donors shift. If we don't have a really solid economic outlook, use the term of being essential versus a charity of choice. And I think a lot of those donors that were on the far periphery or felt that they were on the far periphery of our cause drifted. It became a lot easier for them to make an argument of where else their dollars were going to go, whether that be to personal or family funding or simply doubling down on investments in those nonprofits that they felt most close to. I think we can also see this in the double-digit decrease of newly retained donors, meaning those donors that gave for the first time in 2022. We saw a bigger decrease in newly retained donors than we did in new donors, which again, I think is indicating that we're seeing a pretty aggressive drill in donors that joined for the first time in 20 that just didn't feel confident coming back. And I think it's, again, a strong argument where we need to focus on both our best donors and those effective strategies, expanding our thinking around what a best donor looks like and how we want to engage and how they want to engage with us. Some of that best effective strategy is some of those tried and true methods. Revenue for sustainers was one of the few places where we saw an uptick. And let the revenue from our sustainers or those donors that tend to give through monthly giving patterns was up 2%. So it's again underscoring our most loyal, our most committed donors are showing up in some bigger ways. So how do we move more donors? How do we identify who are most likely to become committed, to want to come closer to the organization and invite them to experiences like Sustainer, like engagement strategies that will drive to perhaps a mid-level giving experience.
Let's look forward a little bit as our last topic for the show today. The government just came out with their Q1 economic report, and the first quarter of 2024 showed some uneven economic results with slower than expected GDP growth. There were also some increasing inflation around personal consumer expenditures. So people spending on things other than essentials like groceries and gas has gone up. And there's continued noise in the news. There is a lot of tension right now with an upcoming presidential election that is going to be happening around Giving Tuesday. So, how can, in this pivotal year for philanthropic giving, can nonprofits be sensitive to all of the factors that are at play and pull out all the stops this year to focus in on the strategies they need to be focusing on?
So there's a handful, a couple of them you've heard me say already throughout our conversation, a couple new ones. First, this is like my drumbeat, rethinking or expanding, I should say expand how we think about the ideal donor, who we want to reach out to, everything from demographic, age, expanding that audience. The second one is consider AI solutions for efficiency and effectiveness. But I always think it's important to bear in mind anytime there's a new shiny object, have conversations about what AI cannot replace. There are things that we shouldn't use AI for that culturally aren't a right fit, but leverage technology, leverage those solutions to better understand your donors, to better create timely conversation, timely outreach with your donors. Focus on sustainers, and that's just subscription behavior. That's, again, a space where our most loyal donors often live. And frankly, it's a spot where we can have a lot of fun as an organization when they sign up, when they agree to give to us over the course of a year. We get to have really fun conversations with them over the course of that year, reinforcing how they're giving matters and the change that they're having in the world. The election year, man, that is, I don't want to say that's a tricky one, but rather harness the energy of the election year. Yes, there's an election going on. It's going to be pretty noisy. And we aren't always, as a nation, our best individuals during that time, but lots of causes and issues will be drawn forward as a result of that. So, especially if you're an organization that can speak to why, in light of the conversation that's happening around us as this nation, why you and your work are more important than ever, I think there's an opportunity there to really take advantage of that energy. As a country, we are more anxious to bring about good or change in the world, so let's harness that energy. Of course, being mindful of the days leading up to election and immediately following. We're going to have a very noisy fourth quarter. And so thinking very mindfully about our communication calendar and how the election will wrap into that. But let's not shy away from it. Let's lean into it. And then finally, again, those donor advised funds, they're going to be a disruptor in this space. Embrace them, leverage them. Think about donor engagement outside of our traditional cycle of cultivation, solicitation, stewardship. Donors expect a true brand experience nowadays. That's what they're getting from their favorite for profit. So, how do we deliver a brand experience that feels near real time, deeply personal, and aligns with how I, as a donor, want to experience your brand, where I want to experience it, through which channels? So, the omni channel, leverage technology to the degree we can to meet that experience that our donors are hoping for.
Kristin, thank you so much for your time today. Any final thoughts as we wrap up?
I think just my final thought is as you look at the FEP report, it can feel very doom and gloom. The percentages, the trends are down. But as we've talked about, the bigger context of what's been happening is an important piece to keep in mind. Look at your subsector trends. Those varied quite wildly, as well as trends by organization size. So there's opportunity here. I think there's some exciting insights that we're seeing. My word for 24 is bold. Don't be afraid to be bold in this year where there's lots of important conversation happening, and we get a chance to be a part of that and to invite our donors to feel powerful, to feel like the change or the good that they want to see done in this world, along with us, they can be a part of something really important.